Welcome to the June 8, 2018 U.S. House of Representatives Manufacturing Caucus Briefing, Revitalizing U.S. Manufacturing. I am today's presenter, Harry Moser. I founded the Reshoring Initiative in 2010 to bring millions of manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. after 25 years as president of the high-end machine tool company now known as GF Machining Solutions. I thank Andy Bikos of the House Manufacturing Caucus for organizing this event. I would like to thank Chris Downs from AMT, that's the Association for Manufacturing Technology. AMT provided the refreshments for today's event. AMT's IMTS, that's the International Manufacturing Technology Show, in Chicago this September is the largest manufacturing trade show in the Americas. This year it is likely to match its current all-time record, which was set in 1998 with 121,000 attendees. I'd also like to acknowledge John Hanson, that's Dr. John Hanson, whose market access charge mechanism is essential to lowering the value of the US dollar and achieving revitalization. John is kind enough to be in the audience today. Thank you, John, for being here. I'd like to start by asking a couple of questions of the audience. Who there believes it is essential to dramatically grow U.S. manufacturing? Yeah, I see most of you agree with me that that's important. Probably you wouldn't have come here today otherwise. But what percentage increase is needed? Most of you are in the 20-30 percentile range. We believe, and I will show you today, that 40% increase is both possible and it's absolutely necessary just to balance the goods trade deficit, not to have a surplus like Germany or Japan or China, but just to balance the goods trade deficit. Who believes that a much smaller trade deficit is an essential part of the solution? Now, thanks for raising your hands. Again, I can see that we're largely in agreement. And who believes that we can add millions of manufacturing jobs by reducing the trade deficit? Good. We actually can add 5 million manufacturing jobs, and I'll show you that during the presentation. Now, since I'm the president and founder of the Reshoring Initiative, it's no surprise that reshoring is going to be a part of the solution to the revitalization of manufacturing. So I'll give you a couple of definitions about reshoring. First, offshoring, that's having things made abroad that will be sold or assembled here. Second, reshoring, backshoring, onshoring, insourcing, a variety of terms, all of which relate to bringing back to the U.S. or to the home country, the market country, the manufacture of products that will be sold or assembled here. FDI is foreign direct investment. It follows a similar logic. So where GM reshores a product to the U.S., Toyota FDIs a product to the U.S. So they're both following the same logic, the fact that they'll be more profitable if they choose to make the product in the market. They wouldn't do that unless they believed it were the case. Localization is a relevant term. Companies such as Caterpillar have followed this strategy, and for example, they might make most of what they sell in North America and the U.S., much of what they sell in Europe and Germany, most of what they sell in Asia and in China, for example. And so the idea is to make most of the product in or close to the market rather than shipping things all across the world. Nearshoring is a relevant term also. And for the U.S., nearshoring would be to make the product in Mexico or Canada and ship it into the U.S. And although we certainly prefer that product be made in the U.S. that will be sold in the U.S., it's better if it's made, for example, in Mexico than in China. And why is that? There are certainly some products where the labor content is so high that you just can't sell them, make them in the U.S. and sell them here profitably. Just can't be done with today's levels of technology. So if we shift the work from China to Mexico, get it near-shored, it's to the benefit of the U.S. because product coming out of Mexico has a 40% U.S. content, whereas product coming out of China has only about a 5% U.S. product. And I'd rather have 40% of a loaf than 5% of a loaf. So that's not to say I want the work to go to Mexico, but it's better than leaving it in China, India, somewhere else. Potentially, the U.S. is the largest beneficiary of all this because we have the largest trade deficit, and therefore we have the most to gain by bringing the work back into the country in which it will be sold. The purpose of the presentation today, my purpose, is to challenge some beliefs. There's a lot of beliefs out there amongst reporters, economists, politicians that I believe should be changed, and I hope I'll achieve that today. I intend to demonstrate the need to grow manufacturing's percentage of the GDP, the importance of a smaller goods trade deficit. Goods means things, objects, as opposed to services, that importing less, which is reshoring, is easier than exporting more. I will document the success that reshoring and FDI have had so far, but that there are limits to that success. And I will propose actions to remove those limits, including alternatives to the tariffs that are so much in debate today. I will overcome the myths that hinder these actions. I will prove that now is the time to act. In this chart, we can see that the red line represents manufacturing's share of GDP, gross domestic product. And you can see it's come down essentially continuously for 70 years, and specifically has declined from about 1970 to today about 50%. It went from about 30% of GDP to under 15%. And that is not a sustainable trend. If the U.S. expects to be the technology leader, if we believe we should continue to be the arsenal of democracy that provides military presence and protection around the world, you cannot do that with a manufacturing content that continues to decline. The impact of this trade deficit, of this declining manufacturing is dramatic. If you compare the U.S. to other developed countries, manufacturing as a percentage of GDP is 3% lower here than it is for those other developed countries on average, and much lower than it is in the developing countries like China. The lower manufacturing output results in less innovation because most R&D comes from manufacturing, and less productivity growth because when your companies aren't growing, they don't have to and cannot afford to invest, and it's the investment that increases productivity. Another way of looking at it, the cumulative trade deficit, so the sums of the trade deficits, since we started to have trade deficits around 1979, is about $12 trillion. That's trillion with a T. And that equals the value of all the NASDAQ stocks, which includes a lot of the high-tech companies we all know. It equals about 2/3 of total U.S. home equity. So the countries and companies and people offshore are holding dollars that they've gotten because of the trade surpluses they've had with the U.S. They're holding those dollars, and that's a call on our assets. They could come in and buy the NASDAQ. They could buy the homes. It's something, I think it's an untenable position for the U.S. Eventually, if we don't fix the trade deficit, if we continue to build up that debt, it's a form of debt, eventually the U.S. dollar will collapse and things will become equilibrated. That's going to be a horrible situation. I'm talking collapse, I mean 50, 70, 90% reduction. The kind of thing that happens to developing countries, not to the U.S. Another way that I think everybody can understand this is the self-sufficiency in the goods that we consume. So of all the goods that consumers and businesses purchase or consume, only about 23% is produced here in the U.S. We're only about 23% self-sufficient. So if there were a major political instability in a major supplier country, if there were major economic or natural disaster somewhere in the world, if we, God forbid, got in a war with a major supplier, the U.S. is not capable to produce the shoes, the apparel, the electronics, the machinery, so much of what we need to equip not just the military, but also to take care of our citizens. And we don't produce the machine tools, the foundry equipment, the textile equipment to build the capability to produce those things. So we're not in a tenable long-term position as the major power in the world. On the other hand, balancing the 700 billion goods trade deficit will have major positive impacts. It will increase manufacturing by about 40%. And I see that coming about as a combination of imports dropping by about 25% and exports rising by about 15%, and imports dropping more because it's easier to reduce imports than it is to increase exports. 5 million more manufacturing jobs. The U.S. budget deficit being cut dramatically. We have a continually rising budget deficit going on into the future. Hundreds of billions of dollars a year would come out of that budget deficit when we have eliminated the trade deficit. We would restore the middle class, and that would eliminate most of the income inequality change that has happened over the years. We would strengthen the SME, small to medium-sized manufacturers. We would strengthen the skilled workforce recruitment. I'm sure most of you have heard about the skilled workforce shortage, and a lot of that's because students, youth, don't want to go into an industry where that they think is dead-ended, that they think is all shifting offshore. As we bring the work back, they will see that it makes sense once again to go into manufacturing. We will increase R&D because manufacturing creates most of that. We'll reduce global pollution. When product is made in China and other developing countries, the factories are more polluting on average. The electricity that's used to run the factories is much more polluting because they use a lot more coal. They don't control the effluent as well. And when you bring the work back, you don't have to ship it a third or halfway around the world. So major impact on the environment. We will increase capital investment in the U.S. by about 20% for 20 years. So we'll have much more capital investment, which will therefore allow both productivity growth and growth in manufacturing employment. So what we see is a virtuous cycle where reshoring increases capacity utilization. The companies have to produce more. Instead of producing at 75%, they'll be at maybe 85% of their capacity. When that happens, they both have the need to invest to increase capacity, and they'll have the financial capability to do so. So they make the investment that increases the productivity. When they increase the productivity, the company becomes more competitive, the U.S. becomes more competitive, and more reshoring is then possible. Now, in contrast to that very desirable condition, we see the condition we're in today, where the Chinese investment in machine tools is about 3 times as high as the U.S. annual investment in machine tools. And that's in an economy that's roughly the same size as ours, and manufacturing output that's believed to be roughly the same size as ours. So they're increasing their productivity at a much faster rate than we are, which makes it that much harder for us to even maintain the share of manufacturing that we have, and certainly to increase our share of that manufacturing. So I mentioned myths before, and there are a number of very powerful but inaccurate myths that hinder the growth of manufacturing in the U.S. The one I hear an awful lot: few jobs can be brought back, so don't even try. And the reality, in 2017, reshoring plus foreign direct investment brought back approximately 171,000 manufacturing jobs. To put that in perspective, that's about 90% of the total increase in U.S. manufacturing jobs during 2017. I read articles all the time about the robots are going to take all of our jobs, tax the robots. And the reality is we will lose more jobs to Chinese automation if we do not automate then we could lose to U.S. automation if we do. There's a study that's been written and totally wrong that claims that about 13% of the 6 million manufacturing job loss between 2000 and 2017 was due to offshoring. The rest was due to productivity. Essentially, all other studies disagree, but this one gets all the press. And the reality is at least 60% of the loss was due to offshoring, and productivity has been historically slow in the last 10 or 15 years. And this is very important, because if you don't believe that we've lost millions of jobs to offshoring, then it's impossible to believe or make an effort to reshore and bring millions of jobs back, because if you didn't lose them, you can't regain them. Underlying a lot of this is the belief that manufacturing employment will inevitably decline like agriculture has, and yet there's a significant difference between manufacturing and agriculture, and that ag is high volume, low mix. Think of thousands of acres of corn or soybeans, and manufacturing is increasingly low volume, high mix, with the customization of products for the consumer. Finally, it comes down to the fact that the U.S. is just not price competitive. We're the team in white that has to run up the hill in the football game as opposed to the team that's going downhill. And how do we know that we lack price competitiveness? Well, we consistently have a $500 billion per year trade deficit. That's the overall trade deficit, and within that, a $700 to $800 billion per year goods trade deficit. And it goes on year after year after year. That means we're not price competitive. If we were price competitive, we would eliminate that problem. And price is the issue. The Reshoring Initiative, in cooperation with Plant Moran, one of the largest accounting and consulting firms in the country, did a survey recently of manufacturers. And the results of the survey were that about 53% of the work of the product that is being imported is imported because of price, and another 20% of it is imported because of things that relate to price, like that product is not available in the U.S. Why isn't it available? Because all the companies in that industry were shut down because they couldn't compete with China or other offshore countries. So so collectively, add these two together, you get about 70%. So somewhere between 50 and 70% of the product that's imported is imported because of price. And so we have to overcome that price gap between the U.S. and the offshore source, or we're not going to be able to bring the work back. This chart shows how big that price gap is. So here's the offshore ex-works price, so the price at the factory, leaving the factory door ex-works, versus the ex-works price in the U.S., the price leaving the factory door in the U.S. Little bits within 10%, and then significant portions are within subsequent deciles coming down here, but about a third of it, the ex-works price is less than 50%, less than 50% of the U.S. price. Overall, throughout this price range, for every 1% reduction in the U.S. price, you pick up about 1.3% of what is offshore. This gives you a feeling for what the problem is to overcome. And obviously our target is to go after this amount of work that's up here that's within range. So some drivers of the uncompetitive U.S. price: skilled workforce. We don't have a very good basic education system, and then we do a poor job of apprenticeships and other forms of training, both quantity and quality of training. Nothing like what, say, Germany or Switzerland do. The U.S. currency is consistently too high. We're the reserve currency for the world. We're the safe haven where everybody likes to store their money, and that drives up the value of the dollar, which makes it so that the U.S. is a great place to have a bank, but a poor place to have a factory. It used to be that currency rates would adjust and the currency would drop if you had a big trade deficit, but that's no longer happening because of the impact of currency and all the flows of cash around the world. Our wage, because the currency is too high, it makes our wage rates too high relative to other countries. Our corporate tax rates have been the highest in the world. They're now down to a typical level for developed countries because we've lost so much work. The factories haven't been operating at capacity, haven't invested. Productivity isn't as high as it should be. Almost all other developed countries have a value-added tax, which taxes our products about 15% when they enter their country and subsidizes their products by 15% when they ship them to our country. We don't do that, and that automatically puts us 15% behind. Our duties are about half as high as their duties on the same products. Our regulations have been extreme. We have supply chain gaps. There's products that aren't made here, and therefore, since those components are not made here, nobody assembles the end product because they can't get the components conveniently here. Other countries subsidize their products much more than we do, and we've all read a lot about the intellectual property theft that's been happening. So all these things tend to make the U.S. overall not price competitive. And the problem is made worse by the fact that the companies look primarily at price or wage rate when they make their decision where to source their products, rather than looking at what we call total cost of ownership. And by so doing so, they miss maybe 20% of the total cost. They miss factors such as the carrying cost of inventory, the travel cost to check on the supplier, the impact on innovation when engineering and manufacturing are separated by thousands of miles, the loss of orders because of stocking out when you have a 3-month lead time where you would not stock out if you had a 3-week lead time from a local supplier. All these factors added together to the price make up total cost of ownership, and most of the companies do not use that metric in making their sourcing decision. The problem was even worse in the past when the wage rate difference was greater between the U.S. and, say, China. But that's improving. This chart shows index unit labor costs. So whatever the labor cost was for each of the countries in the past, the unit labor cost, the labor cost to produce a product, call it 100, and then each year going forward, index for the average percentage wage increase, for the change in the currency and the productivity of each of the countries. And you can see how China is an outlier. So the labor cost to produce something in China has gone up dramatically, like 4 times from what it was back 15, 18 years ago. So work is coming out of China, and the challenge is, will it go to Vietnam, Cambodia, India, Mexico, or will it come to the U.S.? And my job, and I hope you accept the challenge also, is to bring it to the U.S. And so far, we're making pretty good progress. So if you look back to the period about 15 years ago, typically we were losing about 250,000 manufacturing jobs a year just to offshoring, bringing back just a few, and so net losing over 200,000 manufacturing jobs a year to offshoring. And by 2016, the rate of offshoring had dropped dramatically. The rate of reshoring and FDI was up dramatically. So net, we had turned positive. So that was a real good start. And then in 2017, we had a further 50%, that's 50% increase going from, again, 2016 to 2017. And the surge for that happened starting primarily in the 4th quarter of 2016 with the Trump election. So companies believing that taxes would be cut, regulations would be cut, that the U.S. would be a more attractive place for them to put their factories in the future. So the industry-led nonprofit Reshoring Initiative, the group that I lead, our mission is to further accelerate that trend. And we help companies bring the jobs back today. That's our major purpose. But we also work to reduce the playing field tilt for tomorrow so that it will be easier to bring the work back. We have an online library of 5,000 or more reshoring articles. You can go in there and search and see who's reshoring and why. All kinds of statistics from that library and from our TCO user database. We have a case studies template where you can report your cases of reshoring and get the fame of being listed there, and also get a free Manufacturing is Cool t-shirt made in the U.S. out of U.S. cotton. We provide motivation for skilled manufacturing careers by promoting the success of reshoring. We're confident that more youth, more guidance counselors will believe that manufacturing is the right career choice. We provide the total cost of ownership estimator software. That's a free software online at our website, and companies use it for sourcing. In other words, they say, where should I buy that widget? Where should I make that widget? And supplier companies can use it to convince their customers to source the parts or to buy equipment and produce things here in the country, in the market where the products will be sold. So here's an example of the use of the total cost of ownership estimator. This is a case where the Chinese price for a unit was $70 and the U.S. price was $100. And so the purchasing agent, the procurement person looks at that and says, wow, $30 difference, 30% difference. I'm going to buy 12,000 of those a year. So that's 30 times 12,000. That's $360,000 of purchase price variance. Of course, I'll have the work done in China. I'd be crazy to have it done here. I'll get my bonus if I have it done here, or have it done in China. But if we can get them to look at the total cost of ownership and see that in China it is now 98, in the U.S. it's 108, so now there's a 10% difference instead of a 30% difference. And assuming the wage rates and productivity rates continue to rise at the historical level, within a couple of years the total cost will be higher in China than it is in the U.S., then hopefully that individual will say, well, the new products, no sense sending them off to be made offshore because it's just going to have to come back in a couple of years. And the work that's offshore, we should start to bring back now, start to plan to bring back, start to hire, train, invest, find suppliers, because strategically it will make sense over the next year or two to bring the work back to the U.S. So to take a deeper look into this price consideration and to understand the power of that total cost of ownership calculation. This is a group of several hundred Chinese cases where the TCO user compared the Chinese source to the U.S. source. And this axis shows the percent that the Chinese price was of the U.S. price. And you can see most of it is substantially lower than the U.S. price. It's somewhere around 70% on average. And this chart takes that same data and smooths it to create this shape, and then overlays the total cost of ownership data for the same cases. And you can see that median point, that mode, goes from maybe 70% up to about 85%. So we close about 15 points of that price gap just by switching to the correct method of measurement, by going from price to total cost. And now the work that logically will be back is the portion where the measurement is 100% or more in China of the U.S. level. And you can see it wasn't very much when we used price, but when we use TCO, it gets to be about 25% of the total area under the red curve. So very important to get companies to make the choice to move to total cost of ownership. So some supportive academic research that looked into the same question. Professor John Gray at The Ohio State University and a team of other professors did an in-depth analysis of 4 companies that had offshored and then decided to reshore their manufacturing. And they summarized that the offshoring decision at these small to medium-sized companies was made by managers that did not have offshoring experience, and that the focus was on the lowest per unit landed cost. And the subsequent reshoring decisions were made after they had learned from these experiences, and then they incorporated additional costs and performance considerations in making the decision. So by going, they essentially went from, in this case, landed cost to total cost. So what's happened here is that the in-depth analysis of 4 companies by this group of professors came up with results that are essentially 100% consistent with the results that the Reshoring Initiative has found by analyzing not as deeply, but across thousands of cases of companies. So another myth that tends to be very prevalent in the U.S. is that exporting is the solution. If you listen to what President Trump and most of the economists have said, we need to open up the other markets where 95% of the people live. We need to open those markets up to our goods, and everything will be okay. And that's just not really going to work that way, because not if we keep our level of competitiveness where it is. So I think this chart makes that crystal clear. So if you have a product that's made in the U.S. and sells in the U.S. market for $100, and one that's made in China and sells here for $80, well, the U.S. price disadvantage is about 25%. But the product that's made here for $100 had better sell in China for at least $115, because you've got duty, freight, carrying cost of inventory, language, legal system, a 15% value-added tax coming into China. So it's at minimum going to have to sell for $115 to have the same level of profitability. And the product that sells in China, that sells from China, sold in the U.S. for $80, can easily be sold in China for $70, probably $60. So you go from having a U.S. price disadvantage of 25% to one of 64%. So clearly, U.S. companies are much more competitive in our home market than they are offshore, because of all these extra costs that are associated going in either direction. And yet, despite this, the U.S. federal government spends 60 times as much promoting exporting as it does promoting U.S. production to substitute for imports, which is, of course, reshoring. Another tool that's relevant to this is put out by Professor Suzanne de Treville of the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. And this looks at it quantifies the costs of stocking out, and those not having the good available for sale when the customer wants it, and of overstocking and having to, for example, dispose of excess inventory, like Christmas goods in February. And so it looks at how much less a product with a long lead time has to be purchasable to be as good a value as a product that you can get with zero lead time. So the long lead time would be, for example, coming from China or India, and the short lead time would be producing it locally. And typically this comes out to be 20, 25, 30%. And essentially you can add this percentage to the percentage, the 15, 20% that we conclude with the total cost of ownership estimator, which can then put that advantage up into the 30% range. Here's a group of companies, just a small group of companies, many of which you'd recognize, big companies up here, smaller brand names down here, and then contract manufacturers. And contract manufacturers play a very important role in reshoring, because for every assembly job at General Motors or GE, there's probably somewhere between 1 and 5 contract manufacturers making castings, pumps, machine parts, pipes, tubes, electrical products, etc., that go into that assembly. And when the assembly comes back to the U.S., much of the supply chain comes back also. My favorite case of reshoring is Mori Corp, which is headquartered in Woodridge, Illinois. And they came to me a little over a year ago, and one of their best U.S. customers was about to start sourcing its product from China, that Mori was going to lose out to a lower priced Chinese competitor. And so Tony, the VP of sales at Mori, and I did the TCO calculation. Mori took the results to his customer, showed the customer that even though the Chinese price was lower than Mori's, the Chinese total cost was higher, and Tony credits the use of the TCO estimator with saving a $60 million order. So by doing so, Mori came out ahead. They kept that business, and the customer came out ahead because finally the customer had a lower overall cost solution. So the library, the Reshoring Library at the Reshoring Initiative, provides data on what industries, these are NAICS code industries, what industries have brought back the most jobs. The transportation is huge because the factories are so big. The technology level of the products that are brought back tends towards high and medium high, but there's an amazingly large amount in the apparel and other relatively low technology industries. The reasons that the work came back, some of it, these are the things that went wrong offshore, and some of it is just distance related, like freight cost, delivery, inventory, supply chain interruption risk, communications, green considerations. Another is country specific, so quality might be more of a risk in some developing countries than in Germany or Switzerland. Rising wages is especially true for China, but also for some other countries. Intellectual property risk tends to be a Chinese characteristic. Then there are the positive things, the things that went right here in the U.S. and the companies reported. You can see government incentives, like state and local incentives, play an important role. Having a skilled workforce was important for them. The ecosystem synergy, so having a good supply chain was important here in the United States. The infrastructure. So these things I highlighted in red are those that the government can do something about. The bulk of the work came back from the countries shown here. China is the source of most of the reshoring, but recently a fair amount of the foreign direct investment. Germany is primarily the source of foreign direct investment, especially automotive industry. The work tended to come back to the southeast of the U.S., the lower wage rate, right to work, lower tax states, but increasingly Michigan, Ohio, New York, Indiana. So increasingly some of the traditional northern industrial states, because of their strong industrial base, because they've gotten more assertive, more flexible, maybe more cooperative, are doing a good job also of attracting the work. This chart provides another perspective on this and shows that the reshoring trend is working. So we took the data, and the data shows U.S. manufacturing employment at the end of each year, and we took the years from 1997, which is just before China joined WTO, till 2006, which is just before the Great Recession, did a regression line through that, okay? And if the trend had continued as it was during that decade, U.S. manufacturing employment would now be substantially below 10 million. And instead, it's about 12.5 million. So U.S. manufacturing employment is about 2.5 million higher than one would have projected. And that's because we're not offshoring at anything like the rate we were offshoring before, and we're reshoring at a dramatically higher rate than we had been before. So this is very good news, but this is still roughly flat, and the challenge is to get this to come back up, maybe not to 18, but maybe to 16 or 17 million, something like that. So the objective, coming back to this chart, is to shift both of those graphs to the right to get the Chinese or the Vietnamese or the Indian or whatever, uh, price and cost as a percentage of U.S. to be closer to 100%, so that the U.S. companies can see that they'll easily see that they'll be more profitable if they bring the work back here. So we believe that we need policies that uniformly lift all industries. We do not agree with the selective use of tariffs, for example, under which steel companies are winners and steel users are losers. Instead, we want policies that uniformly lift all industries and do not, in that sense, pick winners or losers. And so we've come up with what we call the Competitiveness Toolkit. And here we list a series of actions that the federal government can take. 15% value-added tax, like the rest of the world. Get the dollar down about 20%, like the rest of the world holds its currency down relative to the dollar. We could get 100% use of total cost and CDF. I showed you those two tools. Have a skilled workforce like Germany and Switzerland. Consistently, this is very high priority. Less regulations. We've had a good start on that, as we have on the getting the corporate tax rate down, lower healthcare costs. If healthcare costs would come down, we would be more competitive here because our total labor costs would be lower. Get our duty rates equal to those of other countries. There's other things that could be added, but this is the factor, what it's comparable to in other countries. This is how much price competitiveness we would pick up from each factor, roughly how long we think it would take to implement, with skilled workforce being the toughest. Healthcare obviously is tough. How hard it would be to pass through Congress, and the severity of secondary impacts, such as getting the World Trade Organization not to try to fight it, not having too much inflationary impact on the U.S., et cetera. So what we'd like the government to do is look at all this data and pick the actions here that are most suitable. Note that the total of the price advantages, if you implement all of them, is about 50%. And so from this chart, the government can say, how much would I like to cut the goods trade deficit? How many jobs will I bring back in manufacturing as a result? How much U.S. price reduction is required if companies continue to decide on the basis of price? And how much is required if we can get companies to use total cost for their decisions? And how long it will take to achieve steady state condition, to achieve the objective. And you can see we had 51 points available on the previous chart, which is 3 times what we need if all the companies use total cost. And it's about 50% more than if they continue to use price. So the point here is that we could set a program over up to 30 years to bring back 5 million manufacturing jobs and only use a portion of the policy changes that were outlined in the previous chart. So in that survey that we did with Plant Moran, the respondents picked what they thought would be the right policies to make things, to get them to bring manufacturing jobs back, to source their components and products here in the United States. And currency took the first place with 20%. Use of total cost, get the tax rate down, have a value-added tax, have skills like in Germany, cut the regulatory burden, et cetera, et cetera. So we asked them essentially the same questions that we've been doing in our own analysis and came out with roughly similar conclusions as to what we had from our analytical perspective. So I mentioned Dr. John Hansen before. He has proposed a MAC, a market access charge. And I'd like to thank John for his excellent work on this. And essentially what this would do is charge foreign financial investors an access charge when they shifted currency, dollars, into the U.S. Because when they buy dollars, they force up the dollar, make it overvalued, make it so that our factories cannot compete. and it creates the overvalued dollar, which is a major driver of the trade deficit. And this market access charge would rise as trade deficits rise and fall as trade deficits fall. And by implementing this, we would have permanent trade balance, maximum employment, and benefits of global trade. So we're not saying to get out of global trade. We're saying to make it balanced, fair, so that the U.S. has trade deficit essentially goes away. So we believe that a lower U.S. dollar achieved most likely through something like the market access charge is the right way to proceed as one of the 4 or 5 actions that we think should be selected. Because if you don't do skilled workforce and you increase your production by 5 million jobs and you have no one to do the work, it doesn't work. So specific recommended actions for Commerce Department: balance the duty rates, emphasize reshoring as much as exporting instead of spending 60 times as much on exporting. For Treasury, get the dollar down, use the market access charge. For the Labor Department, pursue apprenticeships. We see a lot of work in this administration. There was very good work under President Obama. We see further acceleration under President Trump, so we're pleased. Much more has to be done. Create stronger arguments for skilled careers. There's a lot that can be done on their websites. The Education Department, we recommend apprenticeship loans. Right now, there's about $1.3 trillion in outstanding college loans, and many of those loans go to students to study fields in which they either don't graduate or they get a degree in which there's nowhere near enough demand for the number of students that are graduated, at a time when we have shortages of tool makers, welders, precision machinists, etc. So we should create apprenticeship loans that would make becoming an apprentice more financially attractive for the worker and for the company. Congress should make the R&D tax credit dependent on U.S. manufacturers. So right now, we get a tax credit for maybe having 5 engineers work for 2 years to develop a product, and that then in effect subsidizes 1,000 workers in China or India to produce the product. We say, no, if you want the tax credit, produce it in the U.S. for 5 years, and then you'll get the tax credit. The EB-5 program is a means of foreigners getting U.S. residency for investing in the U.S. We believe there should be a preferential requirement for manufacturing. Why is that? How much good does it do the U.S. economy to have the foreigner invest in a new restaurant? It probably puts an existing U.S. restaurant out of business because the size of the restaurant market doesn't go up. Whereas if we told them, if you want this deal, you've got to open a factory that produces a product that's not being made in the U.S. and there's a big demand for here, and that will create increased production of the products that component goes into. Now that individual is really bringing value to the U.S. market. We should have a value-added tax. We call on the President and Congress to repeatedly call on companies to do the math, to not just tell them to bring back to work, but to do the math, to prove that they've done the math, and because then the companies will see it's in their own self-interest to bring the work back. So we believe the skilled workforce is an especially important part of this. Same kind of a virtuous cycle. As the reshoring happens, it'll get easier to recruit because everyone will believe in manufacturing careers. We get a better skilled workforce, productivity goes up, competitive goes up, and reshoring again becomes more successful. So as an example of what has to be done, the Labor Department called me down to the Secretary of Labor's conference room in 2011 and asked me to prove to them that what they should do to strengthen the workforce in preparation for all of the reshoring. And I stood up and said, well, first, the Labor Department has to stop being part of the problem and become part of the solution. And fortunately, they didn't kick me out, but they said, okay, what do you have? And I pulled up their Bureau of Labor Statistics chart that shows income going up with number of degrees and headlined education pays. And I said, this is the kind of data that causes the educators, the guidance counselors, the politicians, the columnists to say everybody should get a university degree because everybody will then make $1 million more in their lifetime, and the economy will boom. And I said, no, that's not the way the reality is. There's a lot of people with college degrees that can't find a job to use their degree, and we should have in here the average income of people that have passed an apprenticeship, and it's going to be either just below or just above the bachelor's degree. And then the guidance counselors and the students will see that you can win also with skills training. And they immediately agreed, and they went about halfway to achieving what I wanted. So we suggest in your communities that you do a couple of things to strengthen your skilled workforce, because we think this is absolutely essential. First, get rid of the terms trades and vocations, call them professions, as the Swiss and the Germans do. You should make clear that work is no longer being offshored, that it's being reshored. Get your media to come to us to find all the local reshoring cases of the month. Get your companies to report it, and have the media report that. And your community, your students will be much more likely to be recruited into manufacturing. We have some programs for states and associations that you can take back to your states and or associations to help drive this process. We call this the import substitution program, to substitute domestic production for import. So we can provide for example, a state or for an association, data on the importers of products, and then what the company is that's importing, address, product, tons per year, offshore supplier, and then train your people to go to those companies and use TCO to convince them that even though the U.S. price might be 20% higher, the total cost is lower. So we can also identify and target foreign direct investment to fill supply chain gaps, so that the foreign companies will become the new and only supplier for a while of making that product in the U.S., and there'll be more jobs here and more demand. We also offer a program for bringing back office work back, so accounting, HR, and IT. So a program to help companies decide to bring their back office processing to the U.S. And specifically, we're looking for a company to test this possibility, and we believe they will find that by doing so, their annual cost of getting that work done will be 50% lower than, in other words, half of their current offshore cost. So we're a nonprofit, a 501c3 organization. We've got 27 sponsors. I mentioned AMT before. DGS is supports us for marketing purposes. You can see a lot of great machine tool companies, trade associations here that support us in our work and make it possible for us to help bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. We think of ourselves a bit as the little Dutch boy with his finger in the dike, holding back the flood of offshoring. And with your help, we can strengthen the dike and push back the offshoring and make the U.S. a great place again for manufacturing. So I appreciate all of your being here today. Thank you very much. You can see our contact information here, but we would very much appreciate the hearing from you and hearing of your opportunities in your state or your organization to bring jobs back to the U.S. We'd be delighted to help you. Thank you.